and actually for the invitation, for organizing a great conference. Both Rob and I have enjoyed participating very much. Given the time difference, unfortunately, we participated mostly through watching the recorded lectures, but nonetheless, we've gotten a lot out of it. I'm glad we're going towards the end because we're going to try to, one, we've learned as we've watched what different people have to say, but we're going to try to build a bit on what some various people have said. As Edmund mentioned, we're economists. We don't purport to have any expertise as classicists in any way at all. So what we do is we tend to build on what classicists do, but then we try to interpret things through the lens of political economy, basically, is one way to think about it. Sometimes we do data analysis, as Edmund mentioned in that particular paper. Often what we've been trying to do is sort of address the question, what can we learn about modern democracy by looking at ancient Greece? And in this project that we're both going to talk about today, and we'll probably go back and forth a little bit in terms of who's speaking, we're asking sort of symmetric questions in the sense where, can we learn something about ancient Greece from the modern world as well as from the modern world about ancient Greece? Now, this is work in progress. We don't have a hypothesis at this point we're testing. We're making no claims of causation. What we've got is we've got two data sets we put together that span a couple of centuries, that involve a couple of hundred states in each of the two time periods we're looking at. And we think that there's some interesting similarities and some interesting differences. You'll have to tell me whether you agree or disagree. But one of the things that would be helpful, if anyone has any ideas, is where we go from here, because we've been debating that ourselves. Let's start with the question, why compare ancient Greece to the modern world? Now, this is not a question I probably need to, ask with the audience we have here, because that's what a lot of our speakers have been doing. But I think it is worth sort of asking, given the kind of exercise we're going to do here. And one answer is a simple one. Well, we've had two periods in human history during which democracy has flourished, and each had a tyranny as well. Therefore, they must be the same, right? Well, of course, wrong. The words democracy and tyranny are Greek and were taken from the Greek. There's no guarantee they're used in the same ways today. Just another example of cultural appropriation. However, there is something I think is very interesting, which is that in both the modern world and in ancient Greece, you have a range of government types. I mean, if one wants to think about governments at a very high level and in a very simple sense, you can span from having one person in charge of everything to having the collective decide things collectively, or you can have some subset. In terms of Greek regimes, we could call that tyranny, democracy, and oligarchy. And those in and of themselves aren't surprising. I mean, there's limited numbers of ways in which humans can organize themselves. But what's interesting is in ancient Greece, you had all of those existing simultaneously, often in similarly successful states. And the same is true in the modern world. And so we've got these two laboratories here. And I think if we go through most of human history, and this I say as a conjecture rather than a fact, I don't think you can find any other time when you will find such a variation in government types amongst purportedly similar states. Now, of course, the polis of ancient Greece, maybe they're more similar than the modern nation state, though I think we can, with the nature of communication, trade, et cetera, I think there's certain commonalities that our modern nation states share as well. So I'll leave it at that, but I think it's a very interesting phenomenon and at least, suggests comparison. Of course, in order to compare, we must at least be somewhat sure that we're talking about the same kinds of things. So did democracy mean then what it means now, and the same with tyranny? And again, these perhaps are not questions I need to address with this audience. Perhaps everybody's willing to take that on faith, but I do think it's worth at least raising. I mean, clearly the formal institutions are very different in ancient Greece with direct democracy, centered in the popular assembly, little distinct judicial branch, maybe no distinct judicial branch, small groups with rotating memberships handling administrative tasks. And some of this has been talked about. And of course, not trivially, and this has come up too, lots of slaves, and also no votes for women. Unfortunately, in those two dimensions, it doesn't necessarily distinguish itself from the modern world. Until the 20th century, there were no votes for women, lots of slaves until the late 19th century. But we have a representative democracy, centered in a strong executive, which Greek city-states, absent the tyrant, didn't tend to have. Giant administrative agencies, lots and lots of differences. So the formal institutions don't look alike. Therefore, is it something we can compare? Well, I think so. I mean, Rob and I both think so here, because you got a common factor, which is the obvious. You've got a broader group of citizens, the demos, the masses, the different terms are used in different places, involved in public policy making. So we can talk about transition to democracy in the modern world, and we know exactly what that means. We don't necessarily know what the formal institutions are going to be, but what we do know, I mean, whether it might be parliamentary, separation of powers, or something else, but we do know we're talking about a change from a system where a more narrow group is making policy to a broader group is making policy. And so I think this notion of democracy is encompassing the broader group is a common theme. It's common to both periods. And I'll quote Abraham Lincoln here. Basically, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. I actually happened to watch Mr. Smith Goes to Washington last night, just coincidentally. But I think that's the idea behind democracy in both times, formal institutional differences aside. So I think that would merit comparison. How about tyranny? Well, that's a tougher one, because as I think as a lot of these discussions have shown, there's sort of it's not necessarily the easiest thing to define. And if what we want to do is a systematic comparison, that creates a challenge. We want to match it with modern, call them dictators, call them autocrats. Well, it's hard to do that without a definition. Now, one thing I think is true is the difficulty of defining precisely is understandable, given that you have different kinds of tyrants or different kinds of dictators. And, Aristotle talks about the all bad versus the half bad tyrants. The half bad, they do some good things that may benefit the masses. And today we could think of a despot, or we could think of what a term that's sometimes used, economically benevolent dictators. Okay, and it's sort of, and this is the paper that Edmund mentioned that we wrote, where we basically talk about these sort of half bad or economically benevolent dictators is paving the way to democracy by taking certain kinds of investments that lead to certain kinds of things. And I won't go into that right now. But it does mean that it becomes difficult at that point to sort of say, well, what exactly is a tyrant, or what exactly is a dictator, and what are we comparing to what? So again, I think there's a common factor one can focus on, and that's that, the autocrat or the tyrant, what do? Well, they possess and they use powers in ways that may violate the rights of the citizens. Do they always violate the rights? Well, not necessarily. It depends on if it's in their interest to do so. But if it's in their interest to do so, they will do so. In other words, neither the Greek tyrant or the modern autocrat is constrained by a rule of law. And I think that makes it distinctly different from successful democracies. And I think this can be highlighted by my favorite quote from the Federalist paper. I'm sure everyone has a favorite quote from the Federalist paper. I'm being facetious there. Now, this is James Madison. This is, for those who don't know, the Federalist Papers are being written as the United States is taking shape, and there's a debate about, how much federal power versus how much state power. And Madison begins by saying something along the lines of, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If men were governed by angels, no checks on government would be necessary. But given that neither of those things are true, in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies on this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. Well, the autocrat/tyrant is very good at the first, controlling the governed. Okay, that they do well. And they have to, because they're not going to stay in power if they don't. And of course, that's where all their efforts can be focused. But that comes at a cost. They do that badly. They don't control themselves. They're not good at controlling themselves. Why are they not good at controlling themselves? Well, they can't have an institutional control. I mean, one is just not going to be feasible if they really are the sole source of power. I mean, who guards the guardian? But beyond that, it's not going to be in their interest, because they want to control. If they want to control the governed, if that is first and foremost what's important, they cannot allow any kind of external control. And so we've got this kind of a trade-off there. So the autocrat is going to be someone who is going to not be constrained. And that, but this is something that came up, I know, in Edmund's talk. I know in Ed Harris's talk, he distinguished, he sort of juxtaposed the rule of law and the tyrant as sort of opposite ends of the spectrum. And so I think it's very much that idea. And I also think it applies in reverse. What we can think of is a successful democracy is one where we can oblige the government. The government is going to be responsive, with lag, with in an inefficient way, blah blah blah. But sometimes it's not so easy to control the governed, and that's so democracies sort of face things do things the other way around in that sense. In any case, what we think is there is a justification to compare across the political institutions of ancient Greece and the modern world. And this has, of course, been our view all along in our research, because that is what we're doing. We're assuming that there are things we can learn about modern democracy or modern tyranny from ancient Greece. And that's, that's sort of a motivating factor there. And it's these ideas that sort of stand behind that. Now, of course, to do a comparison, you need a data set. Okay, I mean, you can certainly do a comparison in the form of saying, well, person X, sort of fits in this category, and so does person Y, but we want to do something systematic. And so what we're going to develop is two data sets. We're going to have a source of data for ancient Greece, which is going to be the Hanssen-Nielsen inventory. We wrote a chapter after a conference in Edinburgh a few years back, so anyone who was at that conference will remember that chapter. But basically what we did is we took section 11 of the inventory, which is a list of constitutions, quote unquote, for 199 polis for an extended period, as the inventory runs, for those who don't know, from the Archaic period through the Classical period. It lists constitutions at the level of democracy, oligarchy, and tyranny. I don't know if constitutions is quite the right word, but that's the title it gives. You can think of that as form of government. And in most cases, there's some kind of reported estimate of timing. In some cases, it's very precise. In other cases, it might simply be, such and such a state had a tyranny late in the 5th century or something along those lines. But from that, we built up a data set, and we discussed that in that chapter we wrote. So that's going to be our source of Greek data. How about modern data? Well, we're going to use something called the Polity 4 database. We've used this in previous research. It's widely used by social scientists. There's a number of measures of democracy out there. If you're interested in comparing modern countries, there's a number of alternate databases that have been put together, but this has the real merit that it spans an extremely long period. It starts in 1800, so it covers 2+ centuries. And it assigns every government for every year a measure that runs from -10, which is most autocratic, to +10, which is most democratic. So there's sort of 21 possible scores. And that's based on various component measures involving constraints on the executive and other things which I won't go into. It's also often evaluated in terms of 3 categories: autocracy, which is the sort of the negative end of the spectrum; democracy, which is the positive end of the spectrum; and anocracy, which is in the middle. And you all probably know what an anocracy is. I did not before I started working with the polity data, but it's a combination of democratic and autocratic features. So in a way, it's sort of a little parallel maybe to what we might think of as an oligarchy. But it gives us 3 categories, which is also what we've got for the Hanssen-Nielsen data, which is very important because we must render these 2 data sources comparable in setup, if not in definitions. We don't necessarily know that what the polity is calling a democracy is directly comparable to what the inventory is calling a democracy. But as I argued earlier, we feel it's sufficiently comparable to make comparison justified. So what are we going to do in each case to make these data sets comparable? Well, what we're going to do is we are going to organize the government types into 3 categories. So for Greece, we've got the 3 categories that the inventory lists: tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. I should mention there's a few residual categories that we just exclude from the data set. There's not very many of them. And then for the modern, we're going to sort of matching, if that's the right word. We're going to look at autocracy, anocracy, and democracy, with each of those being sort of the modern equivalent of the prior one. The case is strongest, I think, for tyranny and autocracy, and for democracy and democracy. Oligarchy and anocracy, I guess we could have an interesting conversation about whether that's a good match or not. One thing I should mention is we're just going to take all these measures as given. Some of them may not be correct. I know I've talked to people about the inventory, and they'll say, well, you know, this particular polis is probably should be called this, or you know, might have been categorized as that, better characterized as that. From our point of view, or actually just as, you know, as a statistical point broadly, having some, you know, some errors in your variables, you know, in the thing you're trying to analyze is not uncommon, and it doesn't produce any systematic bias as long as those are just random. Okay, and so what we assume is if there's a few random mistakes here and there, I mean, if you have enough random mistakes, you know, clearly you're getting nothing but nonsense. But if there's a few random mistakes here and there, it's not really that big a deal. Is how we're treating this, and we realize, you know, it's difficult enough to get data on the modern world. When we're talking about ancient Greece, it's extremely difficult, of course, as you all know better than we do. So that's just part of what we accept when we work with data like this. We group the data into 11 20-year intervals because the inventory data is often not precise. The polity data is available for every country for every year. For certain polis, the inventory data provides government, you know, or constitutions for close to every year. We might think of Athens, for example, but for a lot of them it doesn't. Like there's one I committed to memory, Henna, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is on Sicily. All we know is they had a tyrant late in the 5th century. So we can't put that in a particular year, but we could put it in a particular 20-year interval. And so what we're going to look at is 11 20-year intervals. That's 220 years approximately. We actually stop a little bit short of that in the modern world because that's when we put the data set together. So we've got Greece from 540 BCE to 320 BCE, and we've got the modern world starting in 1800 and going up to the year 2015. So the result is 2 data sets with roughly equal number of states over roughly equal number of time periods. For the ancient Greek data, we have 176 polis after we eliminate those who either don't have a constitution type clearly defined or don't have a time period. And for the modern world, we have 194 nations. Okay, so far so good. Okay, well, to sort of make this a little more concrete, let's just take a look at this data. And I'm just, at this point, I'm not going to break it out into constitution type, just the number of states with the government type reported. And this is again by our 20-year intervals. And so what do we have here? We've got the number of polis. So what does it say? And so for the period 540 to 520, because we're working by 20-year intervals, there were 40 polis for which we have constitution data. That jumps for the period 440 to 420 up to between 60 and 80. Looks like it's getting close to 70 here. It looks like it's maybe about 75, and so on and so forth. Here we have, you know, number of nation states. Now, I think polity requires a state to have a population of 500,000 before it includes it. So these are all going to be states with a population of 500,000 or more. And again, we can see that back in the 1800 to 1819 period, the beginning, we've got about a little less than 40 states. That jumps to maybe a little less than 50 in the next period. But by the end of the period, we're up at around 170, between 160 and 170 states. Okay, so the patterns we see, you know, look ostensibly similar in the sense that we start off with not so many, actually drops a bit in Greece, but then jumps and then goes down a little bit. The modern data is more clearly growing over time, but there's actually an important difference between the two, and it's one that that we really want everyone to be aware of, and we have to be aware of because it could really affect our results in an important way. In the modern world, we get an increasing number of states over time because new states are being created. We had colonies breaking, you know, that become independent countries. We have the USSR breaks up, Czechoslovakia becomes the Czech Republic and Slovakia. We could go on and on. What this means is we can look at any point in time, any country that disappears from the data set, we can say, oh, well, here it is, or here's why it disappeared. Yes, there's no longer Czechoslovakia because now there's a Czech Republic and there's a Slovakia. Or there's this Czech Republic suddenly appeared. Where did it come from? Well, it used to be part of this Czechoslovakia. That's not what's going on with the inventory data. With the inventory data, we get a single mention of many of the city-states in our sample. In fact, more than half, we get just a single message. So, for example, that Henna I mentioned before on Syracuse, we know they had a tyranny, or according to the inventory, they had a tyranny late in the 5th century. We don't know what preceded it. We don't know what followed it. We don't know what happened to Henna's government afterwards. So we have these appearances and disappearance that are unexplained. Again, if they're random, if we can treat them as random, that's not a problem. Okay, I mean, as statisticians say, it adds noise to the data. It makes the relationships a little bit harder to discern, but it really doesn't bias things in a particular way. However, if there are certain kinds of states that are more likely to disappear, for example, the tyrannies that turn into democracies are those that we hear about. The tyrannies that don't turn into democracies are the ones that we don't hear about. Then that can bias our results. And so we have to be aware of that. Now, if we were to proceed further with this, there's probably some, more formal tests that we might do, but we're going to just do a couple of simple things to see if this assumption that these disappearances and appearances are random, and we come to the conclusion that they probably are. So we will proceed with some degree of confidence. So let's now finally turn to comparing the government types over time. Now note, actually, if I go back, this is in terms of number of states. Okay, now I'm going to switch, or we're going to switch the number of constitutions or government types. Okay, meaning the same thing. Democracy, oligarchy, tyranny, democracy, anocracy, autocracy. The difference between the two is due to the fact that we've broken things down by 20-year intervals. In a given 20-year interval, a state might have more than one government type. So it might be a tyranny for part of that 20-year interval and a democracy for another part of it. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about transitions, but it does mean that the number of states is going to be less than the number of constitutions. Well, to compare the modern world and ancient Greece, we put things in terms of 100% bars. So this is just 100% of the constitutions in each case, 100% of the government types. So again, blue is democracy, orange is oligarchy or anocracy over here, and gray is tyranny or autocracy. And what do we see? Well, actually, we see some sort of interesting patterns. One, we see in each case, tyranny, autocracy are the most common regime type at the beginning of the period. Democracy is the least common. There aren't many of them. And we see a steady increase in democracy over time, more or less steady. We sort of see it growing, then a sort of jump there, and then maybe bounces around a little bit. But by the end, we've got 50% of the polis are democratic. We see a somewhat similar pattern in the modern world. It takes a little bit more time. But again, by the end, we got 50% of the polis in the modern world democratic. This comes principally at the cost, so to speak, of fewer tyrannies in the ancient world. This a little bit different there, and fewer autocracies in the modern world. And the sort of the middle category we can see in this middle period becomes much more common. But by the end, we've got actually distributions in this last period of political types that are almost exactly the same across the two, which is, sort of interesting. All right, but this still begs the question about, how about these appearances and disappearances? Are they biasing things in a particular way? Well, the first way we're going to look at that is we're just going to compare a common sample. That's to say we're going to look for both periods of time, both the modern world and ancient Greece, a set of states, and it's going to be a relatively small set of states that provide, for which we have government types for all of the periods. And we're going to see, do they look like the mass of the states? Okay, so we've got 11 polis for ancient Greece, for which we have reporting of government types from 540 onwards, every one of the 20-year intervals, and we got 19 countries in the modern world. Well, what do we see? Well, in ancient Greece, if we just look at those, we see that tyranny is somewhat less common among those than it was in the larger sample there. But other than that, the pattern is fairly similar. And what we see is a growth of democracy over time that sort of falls back a bit. We end up with half of all states democracy, even among these 11 polis. With respect to the modern world, we see almost exactly the same relationships we see when we were looking at the whole set of countries. So we take a little bit of comfort from this so we can go on to talk about transitions, because it does seem like the appearances and disappearances probably aren't having a big effect on the results. And speak up, Rob, whenever you have anything to say. So let's move on to transitions, which is what we're interested in. Well, now we got the next thing to do is you have to find what does it mean, a transition in the context of the data set. Well, what we're talking about is a change in government type, okay? So for our purpose, a transition is a change in government type or not, because as you'll see, not changing government type is also, we're going to sort of, it's one of the possible outcomes. And we'll go through an example to make that a little clearer. Within or between 20-year intervals. So if within a 20-year interval, a state could go from tyranny to democracy, and then moving to the next 20-year interval, it goes back to tyranny, we'd say, we have two transitions. One was a transition from tyranny to democracy within the 20-year interval, and then a transition from democracy back to tyranny as we move to the next 20-year interval. Okay, so for example, assume state Y is a democracy in a given interval. It may remain a democracy into the next interval, in which case it would be a D to D transition. Now you might say that's not a transition, it just remained a democracy, and that's absolutely right. But what we want to do is we want to classify these and compare and count them up basically to see how many there are. So this is, we're going to call, it's sort of, you think of it as a stable transition, if that makes sense. So it just stays a democracy. Alternatively, it could transition to an oligarchy within the interval or as it moves to the next interval. And that would be a D to O, democracy to oligarchy transition. Or it could transition to tyranny within the interval or as it moves to the next interval. D to T, or democracy to tyranny transition. Or it can disappear from the data set. So we're going to start off by looking at some of these. And, for simplicity, we're just going to call it limbo. So it goes from democracy to limbo. It just disappears. So that's a type of transition too. It just disappears from the data set. It's also possible for a new state to appear in the data set, and let's say it appears as a democracy, so that sets our final possible transition, and that would be from limbo into the data set, and that would be a limbo, in this case, to democracy transition. Same would be true for the modern data, okay? So I hope that's clear. I'm open to question now if there's anything anyone would like clarified. All right. So we calculate and chart the transitions for all states, okay? So basically, again, just to sort of summarize, what could happen? A state could remain the same, okay? A tyranny remains a tyranny, an oligarchy remains an oligarchy, a democracy remains a democracy, or the regime could change to another government type. A democracy could become a tyranny could become an oligarchy, etc. Or it could disappear from the data set. A tyranny just disappears, goes into limbo, or it could appear in the data set for the first time. Okay, so those are the possibilities. And each of those is represented in this chart right here to the right. And we have ancient Greece up here, and we've got the modern world here. We got the number of occurrences. And I'm going to ignore the stuff to the left. I'm going to come back to that on our next slide. And instead, I'm just going to focus on this, because this is what we're a little worried about. Those that this is one that disappeared, this is one that appeared, disappeared, appeared, disappeared, appeared. What we see is there doesn't seem to be anything biased to a particular government type. In other words, it looks like a tyranny is just as likely to disappear as an oligarchy or as a democracy, and vice versa, and just as likely to appear as the others. So again, this suggests that the appearance and disappearance are random for our purposes. Doesn't mean they're random in some kind of absolute sense. It may simply be that, Herodotus happened to be looking at, Anatolia, and so he's got a bunch of states there. What it does mean is it's not correlated with the type of institution that the polis has at that moment in time. It does not appear to be anyway. And again, this is the kind of thing we'd probably want to do something a bit more formal before we proceed much further. But I think it gives us more confidence that we're dealing with a data set where we can sort of ignore the appearances and disappearances. We can see the difference also when we look at the modern world. What we see not so many states disappearing, of course. We see a lot of states appearing, and a lot of that is because we see collectives being broken up into smaller states, but we're not really worried about those for the modern world because we know where the states came from and we know where they went. Okay, so we take this as further support, that part on the right, for treating ancient Greek appearances and disappearances as random. So that's good. So now we're going to look at transitions, and we're going to exclude the appearances and disappearances to make it a little bit easier to understand. So this is the same two charts we saw on the other page, but with all of those things to and from limbo excluded. And so what do we see? We put the axis, so they're the same. So they count up to 300. And this is the number of occurrences of each. Now, we see in ancient Greece, the most common kind of transition was an oligarchy to oligarchy. In other words, the most common thing to see was an oligarchic regime that stayed an oligarchic regime, followed by a democratic regime that stayed democratic, followed by a tyranny that stayed tyranny. And that's different than the modern world, where autocracy to autocracy seems to be the most common transition. But again, these other three are head and shoulders above the others. We note that isn't head and shoulders over here. We see that, for example, the tyranny to tyranny transition is less than either the oligarchy to democracy transition or the democracy to oligarchy transition, but in large part because there just are not that many tyrannies as compared to modern autocracies, as we will see later. Now, the other way to look at this is in terms of 100% bars. So this is everything from tyranny. So from tyranny, what could happen with a tyranny? It could stay a tyranny, or it could become an oligarchy, or it could become a democracy. And so we've just put that in terms of the percentage of times each of these occurred. And what we could see is that tyranny remaining a tyranny happens, about 65% of the time. About the same, a little bit higher, maybe an oligarchy remaining oligarchy, democracy remaining a democracy, a bit lower, about 60% of the time. So if you were to take a bet, you had nothing but the information here, you would, and somebody says, well, there's a tyranny in state X, what do you think it'll be next period? Your best bet is to say it will be a tyranny. Modern world, we see more or less the same kind of thing. Again, it's about 60% for autocracy, so not that different than for tyranny. It's actually somewhat lower for the anocracy than it is for the oligarchy, which is close to 70% compared to 50%, and it's somewhat higher for the democracy. Democracies, D to D, are likely to stay democracies in the modern world to a greater extent than our democracies in ancient Greece, which is sort of interesting. Well, what else do we see? Well, we see that actually a transition from tyranny to democracy was relatively common in our ancient data set there, and very uncommon in our modern data sets. To the degree there are transitions from autocracy, they tend to go to anocracy rather than to tyranny. And this, to some degree, may be a measurement issue, and I will come back to that in just a bit. Let's see, what else do we see here? We see that basically there's, the most common kinds of transitions are from oligarchy to democracy and from democracy to oligarchy. So O to D and D to O seem to be the most common outside of what we could think of as sort of the stable transitions where the states are staying what they were. And if we look at the modern world, it's more or less the same. So from anocracy to democracy and from democracy to anocracy are pretty common. Though it's actually even more common for an anocracy to go back to autocracy. And it's very common for an autocracy to become a democracy. We actually see very few oligarchies transitioning to tyrannies. In fact, a smaller percentage, slightly, not much, but slightly smaller than for democracies. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the way the polity, the way polity score is measured, it's running from -10 to +10. So imagine that a state transitions from a pure autocracy with a score of -10 to a pure democracy, or an extreme democracy with a score of +10. What somehow has to cross that route that's going to cover anocracy. So whether some of the lack of movement directly from autocracy to democracy relative to the Greek word is just due to the way it's measured is an open question we'd have to look into further. Another thing to keep in mind is that the occurrences of these, as sort of alluded to earlier, are very different. So this is the number of tyrannical regimes that transition to something. Okay, either that stayed tyrannies or transitioned to oligarchies or transitioned to democracies. They make up only 18% of all of the regimes we have here, all of the constitutions in ancient Greece, versus 38% accounted for by autocracy. And whereas the number of autocracies and anocracies are about the same in the modern world, we can see the number of oligarchies vastly outnumber the tyrannies in ancient Greece, which is an interesting difference and may suggest some kind of a different relationship. Again, we'd have to worry a little bit about how things are measured and whether that's influencing things, how the polity score or how polity scores things. Democracy is about the same in percent. It's somewhat higher in ancient Greece as a percent than in the modern world, which is also interesting because it's it's also more changeable, as we can see that you know, there's a smaller proportion of states that remain democracy. Now, these are interesting and tell us something about transitions, but in these bars here and in these other charts, we're averaging our 220 or so years and producing one, you know, set of numbers for each of these. Another way to look at it is to look at it by time interval, and that's what we're going to do next. Okay, so we'll look at the same things, the likelihood of how are transitions occurring, but we'll look by 20-year intervals. Now, there's a lot of different combinations we could look at. At this point, we didn't think it was worth going through the whole gamut of them. So we're going to look at two transitions. We're going to look at transitions from tyranny / autocracy, tyranny in ancient Greece, autocracy, and we're going to look at transitions to democracy. Okay, so this is movements from tyranny into democracy, and we're looking by period. So again, we can think of this as a sort of, it's the equivalent of a 100% bar. It's telling us the proportion of the states that do something. So this is going from period 1 to period 2. So this would be from 540, 520 to 520, 510, for example. Same thing here from interval 1 to interval 2 would be from 1800, 1820 to 1820, 1840. And what we see, and this is tyrannies that remain tyrannies, autocracies that remain autocracies, that's the blue. And what do we see initially? Basically, tyrannies stay tyrannies for the most part, with a very high proportion. And autocracies stay autocracies with very high proportion. But then that drops pretty dramatically. So tyrannies increasingly transition to things other than tyranny, either to democracy or autocracy. Then it rises again. Then it falls again. Then it rises again. Then it falls again. And I mention that because strangely enough, the modern world looks a lot the same in that dimension. So autocracies start off basically just remaining autocracies, then it starts to fall, and then it falls a lot. Okay, so that autocracies are actually more likely to transition to some other system, either democracy or anocracy, than to remain autocracies. Then it rises again, then it falls again, then it rises, and then it falls quite low. So actually at the end, both are at about the same level. And I have no explanation for this, but the pattern is very, very similar for the two time periods there, which I find quite interesting. Now, where they're going actually, though, is quite different, as you can see. So we have early in the period, you know, early in our time period anyway, we have a lot of these tyrannies are transitioning to democracy. Then that becomes very rare for most of the rest of our time periods. This is going to be, you know, sort of maybe the middle of the 4th century, middle of the 5th century approximately. And from then on, it's really oligarchy that's the place that our tyrannies are going if they don't stay tyrannies. But then democracy jumps up at the end, whereas autocracies, when they're transitioning, they're almost always transitioning to anocracies. And the one exception is we do actually in this more recent period start to see things creeping up a little bit, which is interesting. I'm guessing some of that is driven by the end of World War II. Some of it is driven by the disappearance of the Soviet Union. But except for that period, we really don't see a lot of transition from autocracy directly to democracy. How about to democracy? Now keep in mind this is moving to. So this is saying what's the source of a democracy is another way to say it. So what's the source of democracy? Well, a previous democracy is the most likely source in the earlier period, and we see that. And then what we see is the most likely source of democracy falls so that it's actually going to be a tyranny during this period right there. During this period right here, the most likely source of a democracy is a former oligarchy. Here it's a former tyranny. Here it's a former oligarchy. Here it's a former democracy that stays a democracy. And it bounces around a little bit there, okay? So this is telling us where the democracies are coming from. Are they coming from states that were already democratic? Or are they coming from states that had some other system? And what we see is that a lot of the time they're coming from states that had some other system. That's not at all what we see when we look at the modern world. The most common source of democracy in the modern world, where do they come from? They were already democracies is where they come from. So this again supports the idea that there's something more, that the democracies of the modern world, they're more durable or more stable or something is going on, because that's really where our democracies are. They're states that become democracy and they stay democracy. On the other hand, we really don't see a lot of the non-democratic states transitioning to democracy relative to ancient Greece. We see a lot of the non-democratic states transitioning to democracy. Throughout the whole period in ancient Greece, we see relatively little of that as compared to ancient Greece in the modern world. So some interesting differences, some interesting similarities. So where does it leave us? Well, at this point, as I said, this is work in progress. So where it leaves us is with sort of, what are the similarities? So let's go through a few just to summarize. So, in each case, in each of the 200-year periods, and maybe this isn't too surprising, tyranny, autocracy is the most common form of government at the start of each 200-year period. Democracy is the most common at the end. So, roughly the same percent of each type in the last period, including the middle category, which is sort of interesting, but not sort of consistent with this notion of a rise of democracy in both ancient Greece and the modern world. But tyrannies and autocracy also become less common in an absolute sense over time as the number of democracies increases, which, sort of is interesting. Is there similar factors at work? Is there something about democracy that makes autocracy / tyranny or less tenable? Overall, stability is a norm in both periods. So if you're going to predict a government type tomorrow, you say, well, I'm going to predict the same government type today. But it does vary over time. And what we see is both tyranny and autocracy go from being highly stable at the beginning of the period to highly unstable by the end. Unstable meaning that very likely to change to something else. So those are some of the similarities that we pick out. There may be others that we've overlooked. How about some differences? Well, democracy expanded much more rapidly in ancient Greece than in the modern world. They hit 50% in about a century, while it took the modern world more than 2 centuries. Democracy, as we've talked about, is more stable in the modern world, or maybe there are more what we might call durable democracies in the modern world than in ancient Greece. A democracy was less likely to stay a democracy, but it was also more likely to transition into, or non-democracies are more likely to transition into democracies in ancient Greece and in the modern world. And so let me finish up with a prediction. Actually, there's a I think it's Niels Bohr is attributed to saying prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. I'm sure people have heard of that. And I looked it up because I was just curious. And I read that he actually said that he did not coin that, but he was quoting someone else. And his purpose was to illustrate the differences between Danish and Swedish humor. Okay, so now we all know the differences between Danish and Swedish humor. So what is the prediction regarding the future? Well, ancient Greece hit 50% of recorded regimes twice. Ancient Greece hit 50% democracy, I should say. So democracy, it hit 50% democracy twice. The modern world has just hit 50% democracy. Ancient Greece fell back each time. Modern world, what will happen next? Okay, and I will end with that. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's been brilliant. It's really interesting to hear such a very different set of methodologies really expounded so methodically. So thank you. But I'm sure there must be lots of questions. I have lots, but I'd like to open to the floor. So please do put up your hand, or you can add your question in the chat if you prefer. Seem to be slow starting, so I might kick off. I'm very interested to sort of what I'd like to hear your opinion on is, again, it's I know this is a sort of, it's a question that you for understandable reasons didn't want to go into too much detail, because I mean, it seemed very sensible to not try and query the data too much and the identification of constitutions. But I wonder if my thinking is that if we could find out a way of not just measuring autocracy, because it seems to me there are lots of good indexes, including the Polity 4 index, and also, I suppose, Freedom House and many of others, that there seem to be good indexes for how free a country is, or what level of autocracy there is, or what level of freedom there is. But I wonder whether, particularly in defining tyranny, whether we shouldn't be focusing more on indexing the concentration of or personalization of power. And of course, there have been attempts to do this in modern political science. But I'm wondering if you had any thoughts as to whether trying to come up with a similar analysis for the ancient world might be either a worthwhile or otherwise activity, and how one might do it. So I'd be very pleased to hear your opinion on any of those points.
Oh yeah, that would be great. We've talked about that, but our problem is that we plan to take the data we have here and analyze them further. But our concern always is with something like that is if we observe in the inventory that it's a tyrant, we just sort of code that as a T. But we don't want to use too much of we don't want to try to use our own judgment, because we're not as confident in our expertise at all. But if you had a systematic way where we could go through without too much of a judgment call on our parts to try and code different kinds of tyrants, that would be really helpful.
Yeah.
So it's just something that we don't really feel at all qualified to do ourselves. But but I do think if it was something, if experts could go through some of the Hanssen-Nielsen index and come up with different kinds of codings for tyrants, that would be extremely beneficial. And in the paper that you mentioned that we published in the Journal of Law and Economics, that was, we were talking about this just this morning. I think it took us about a year after we had the data. We had help from Josh Ober and others getting the data set together. But we thought, oh, this is just fantastic. But I think it took us about a year to realize how we thought we could reasonably use the tyranny observation, and that it's just, if there was an early observation of tyranny, it was very likely a half-bad tyrant, as opposed to the later tyrants. So our what we did with that paper was we only, the observation of tyranny was, did you have an early tyrant? So that was about the only thing we thought that, we were relatively confident, but it's all based on worship of classes. Try not to put too much of our own judgment in, that we could actually sort of say, okay, this kind of tyrant, may lead to basically economic growth that would later lead to a broader democracy. That's our, our hypothesis there. But in short, yeah, better data on the nature of tyrants would be fantastic.
Yeah, and I mean the same point holds for the modern data, in the sense that one always wants to sort of avoid the appearance of cherry picking. But if there's some way, as you say, to match some other score, and therefore, if you said, well, basically a tyrant is, someone who allows, has authoritarian rule but allows substantial personal freedom or freedom in some dimension, and maybe try to match the authoritarian index with some other index. Another thing which we have thought about is, autocracy using the polity categories is 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 in those scores. I mean, you could just restrict it to 10s if we wanted just to, have absolute, autocracy, or we could do something else. So I guess that's always the challenge, is you want an objective measure. It doesn't, and you're not limited in what those measures could be. If you said that, an important part of a tyrant is that he's got a personalized rule, but then you'd need some kind of objective way to, and there probably are. I mean, weird measures are possible. You might look at the number of biographies that have been written about a dictator, something like that. But, if there was some way to do that, that would certainly improve the measures. And I think that's always one of the challenges, is if you can, seek better measures of what you've got, because we always know, particularly when we're looking at the level of countries, even modern countries, the measures are usually not great. So.
Thank you. And I was, if I may just follow up on that, one of the other questions I had, which is connected to that one, is your table for the proportion of autocracies or tyrannies in the ancient world. What struck me was obviously the level during the mid-5th century, the number of tyrannies goes down. But it didn't completely disappear on your table. And of course, I was thinking of Thucydides' statements that basically the tyrannies were disappeared in the first half of the 5th century, except in Sicily, and then of course they all fall apart in the second quarter of the 5th century. But what I was wondering was in that, so that little, what is it? It's in 460 to 440, and then 440 to 420. Whether those are the tyrants represented there are some of them might be classed as kings, as basileis. Or whether you had any thoughts on that, or were some? I'm wondering how many of them are tyrants? Because I think it would be quite significant to say that tyranny is something that actually is a constitution that actually persists. It may drop considerably in that period in the 5th century, but it does seem to persist. Looking at your table all through the period, which is quite a notable point, I think.
Well, to the best of my knowledge, and we organized the data set a while ago, we excluded, I mean, basileus, however that is pronounced, I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, is a category, but those we excluded. So the only things we've got in the tyrant category are things that the inventory lists as tyrants. Now, we don't double check whether the inventory is doing that correctly. We have, neither the skill, and well, we certainly don't have the skill to do that. So the training to do that. But I think that anything that is there is what is listed as a tyrant by the inventory, not as what's listed as a kingship or anything else. But I mean, we could certainly go back and look, and I mean, it wouldn't be that hard to say these are exactly the states that are in there at that period, or the polis that are in there, and this is, these are who they are. So I'd certainly be happy to supply you with that information if you're interested.
Do you recall, Andy, how many there were? I didn't recall it.
Well, yeah, the basileus, yeah, no, not too many, a handful. I mean, I think that the basileus and one or two other residual categories amounted to, less than 5% of the total constitutions. And so we just did, I mean, we excluded them completely. We didn't lump them in with anything else.
Yeah, we should check on that.
But it's always worth checking.
Really good idea to check.
Yeah. No, thank you for clarifying that. I think we've got a question from Valentina Minosa.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you.
Hi, thank you for this lecture. I have two different questions. The first one is, I have worked on tyranny in Syracuse, and in my experience is an interesting feature in the transition from tyranny to democracy and vice versa is often the stasis, the civic war. So, which is often an interesting sign of the social tension that tyranny embeds, and also, in a way, democracy ignites. So I was wondering if you also took into account the moments of tensions and of civic wars in these transitions by working also on their genesis and on their consequences on the different governments. And my second question, that is a provocative one, it's that, is it possible to take into account all the variants that a city or a state has in itself on a social, cultural, and political level that also are the origin of this phenomenon of democracy and tyranny in your model? I don't know if the questions are clear enough.
Oh, yeah, no, I think they're quite clear, and they're both excellent questions. To deal with the stasis question first, again, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that's very interesting. And the inventory actually also lists an appendix where they do have that by state. And Syracuse is hugely, in excess of every other place. I mean, it really is quite striking. And we have another paper draft, partly done, of political stability in ancient Greece, where we do try to make use of that measure. And we hadn't related it directly to tyranny, but there's no doubt that Syracuse is an outlier when it comes to the number of those cases. And so there are definitely other useful measures. I mean, we think the inventory is a great start at putting together what would be, a very sort of useful systematic database. And that's a sort of a natural segue to your next question, because I think that's a very reasonable question, and that's a question that we certainly get asked a lot. And I guess I'll answer it one way, and then I'll let Rob, you'll probably answer it another way. But I think there's a variety of ways to investigate, let's say a forest. Okay, one way is to walk through the forest and look at all of the trees, and you don't have time maybe to look at them all, but you look at a few, and you really get to know them all really well and all of their features. The other way is you fly over in an airplane, take some pictures, and then you do some calculations, and then you look and you see what kind of features seem to appear most frequently in certain settings. And then you use some kind of statistical model that says these features seem to be correlated with the nature of that forest. Each of those is going to get something that the other doesn't, and each is going to miss something the other doesn't. And so whenever you take a set of observations, as we would call them, countries or trees or anything else, what you're doing is you're saying, okay, we're going to look at the common factors. That's what our analysis is intended to get. We know there are all kinds of differences, but our expectation is if our sample is large enough and we actually can control for certain things, those wash out. That's not always going to be a reasonable assumption, and that's one that you really have to think very carefully about. But that's it's sort of that kind of a different approach where you're saying, okay, I'm going to rely on, a sort of a law of large numbers things and identify the common factors in a large set. And it certainly depends also on somebody looking in detail and making sure that you're not completely off base when you do that kind of thing. So I see those two approaches as very complementary. Each one brings something that the other doesn't to some degree. And that is, as economists, that's what we tend to do, is we tend to, look at a large data set and identify the common factors in a statistical sense. But, of course, that's not to deny that there are a lot of other things going on there that we may not be able to capture in our statistical analysis. And if we're too reckless in doing that, we're going to miss something really important potentially, and we may end up coming to conclusions that are entirely wrong. Do you want to expand on that, Rob?
Yeah, I can probably add a little bit, but I think that's one of the core questions that doing work like we do, we have to ask is, one is, just to note is we're looking at we're not trying to get an explanation of everything. We're just sort of trying, at the margin, is there something we can add to understand? And sort of, like Andrew said, looking at this from a distance, we're just looking for patterns. And so we would never have the kind of work that we're trying to do with these data. We're not going to have a good explanation of any given polis. But maybe can we explain why some certain characteristics of the set of polis might make them more likely or less likely to develop a tyranny or not, or something like that. And another thing that I think is useful to keep in mind is that any kind of work like this is, we could certainly be wrong. Just whenever you're doing statistical analysis, even the work we've done where we're pretty confident we've got something, even the size and the effects we're estimating is certainly wrong, right? It's never going to be accurate, but we want to be reasonable. But that's, it's very likely that, with the addition of new data or something like that, if we've estimated some positive effect, it could be a sort of a large effect, a small effect, or even a negative effect or something like that. So I think that's just sort of the nature of the work. And, but I also think it's just, partly why, if at the beginning, Andy said we're not trying to make any claims of causality here. We hope to in the future, but, we're trying to stay very guarded, because sometimes it's just, I think it's just not possible to draw some conclusions. And to give you a modern example, that I think almost all economists and political scientists, and most people in general, just think that in the modern world, democracy helps spur economic growth. So, if you democratize, go for liberal democracy and try to get, the rules of the game right, it's generally, it's most of the time it's going to lead to growth. Sometimes no. But that's something that, with modern data, you got about 200 countries, a lot of years, but, there's an ongoing debate, and it's not really between people who think democracy causes growth and they think it doesn't. It's just economists trying to figure out, do we have good evidence of how much democracy will lead to growth? And, I think the most recent work is relatively convincing, but even though I'm pretty darn confident about the size of that the effect is positive, the work is just not that convincing. And even like things like, international trade and growth, almost any economist thinks that trade is very important, but actually demonstrating that empirically is difficult. And I think it comes right back to the question you asked, is that there are just so many other differences between countries. The countries that tend to be open to trade tend to do a lot of other things also that probably encourage growth. They tend to have strong rule of law, relatively stable regimes. And so, we may, in looking at the ancient data, it's going to be more difficult. So we're just trying to figure out what we can make as sort of reasonable assumptions, even if they're not completely true, and move forward. And try to be modest.
Well, it's very interesting to see the big pattern and the different trends. As an historian for the ancient world, I've learned that models are very tricky, and we have to be aware that in the moment we are dealing with models and trends and big patterns, we are just sometimes in the ancient world going too far, because it's the first problem in our scholars is the use of models, and we are trying to just keep it in distance now. So that's my kind of caveat, but the work is very interesting. So thank you for the lecture.
Thanks. Well, your caveat is very well stated. we believe you.
And we have another question from Kenneth Arthur.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professors Fleck and Hanssen. It's very interesting to see you in person, because maybe virtually, but I've come across I think the work that you did on the Copenhagen project, and then it was I must say that it was very massive, because myself my dissertation is on regime change as a geopolitical tool in classical Greece. So I am looking at something within that sphere one way or the other. And then, I'm looking at how regimes one way or the other transition from one to another, or even back, just like what you've done so far. And then what interests me the most is, basically the question that I want to ask is how often is regime change, when you are looking at, the transitions, how often do you see that in the modern world? Looking at a time period that you have given, how often is it? Was it that rampant, or was it just, coincidental that once in a while you see that there is a regime change from, one particular government to another? And then my second one would be that in looking at the modern sense of regime change, or constitutional transition, in the modern world, does it always end up in the institutionalization of democracy? So does it always end up from, maybe being autocracy to eventually becoming a democracy? Does it happen in that way? Is it always the case?
try that, or?
No, it's a good question, and partly, we don't know where the world's going to be in another 50 years, but I think that it's over the longer period of time, there does tend to be more transitions to democracies, but it's not the case that there's some countries sort of, as Andy showed in the data there, sometimes countries will switch to democracy and just stay democracy. Other times there's sort of a couple attempts and they eventually make it. But it's also the case, if you look at especially Eastern Europe, there were countries that looked like they were making progress toward democracy, and then they were under authoritarian rule. And then, comes 1989, and very shortly after that, you get these transitions. But even among those, those countries, some places the democracy, was adopted rapidly and is pretty much stuck. In other cases, it's more tenuous. So, I think that comes back to, Valentina's point there. I think we can sort of look at the broad patterns and sort of see where, trends towards democracy, and, but it's not the case that you can look and sort of say this, it's not just like this continuous trend, because sometimes there's just like this burst forward. And that's somewhat you can see sort of the tail end of our data, our modern data. But even when you see this jump forward, it's not clear where that goes the next period. There can be backsliding. And it just, my own assessment, I mean, if you'd asked me in 1994, what I thought, I'd read quite a bit about Eastern Europe and actually lived in Hungary for 2 years, I would have guessed wrong on a lot of the transitions. And I think that's something that, looking at the data like we have, we see we see broad patterns, but the individual cases can be very different than that. And I think also can be very difficult to understand. Does that answer your question somewhat? Or?
Yeah, it does. It does, because I was also looking at the cases for regimes that certain African countries have experienced over a long period of time. I think most African countries, when most African countries started gaining independence from the late 40s into the 50s and right up until now, you would realize that most African countries, transition from, if I can put it, a military regime into what we, now term as, a democratic state. And then one, vivid example that I can give, my case, because I'm from Ghana, is the fact that, the very first prime minister of Ghana, he transitioned because I think at that time, Ghana was under, British rule, basically. And then he fought for independence. And then being Ghana becoming independent, transitioned from, being under the British rule at that time to a government they call self-government now. So basically, it was related to, being a democratic state one way or the other. But later, there were a series of, military coups. So you would realize that the history of Ghana is basically, entrenched in, from a military coup and a military regime to a democratic state, from a military regime to a democratic state. So we see that shifting there. And then a military regime, basically what we can term that as is, some form of a tyranny, if we can put it in that sense, that, a military regime is equivalent to a tyranny or a tyrannical regime. And then another example is that of, Gaddafi's regime, where basically during his reign, he was considered a tyrant. And then, we know the story behind that, the CIA, and then eventually Gaddafi was overthrown, and democracy was, institutionalized in Libya. But after democracy had been institutionalized, Libya has never been the same. War still persists, turmoil, the economy is very bad as of now. That, brings me back to my question of if it is always, or it is supposed to be, the case that democracy should be the preferred form of government, even in our modern times now. So it does answer the question, but, it just got me thinking. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think might be interesting to think about in that context is that, and I mentioned some of the difficulty in sorting out the causality between democracy and economic growth is, it's obvious to look around the world, and most of the wealthy countries are democracies, a couple exceptions. But what's causing what? Yeah, and this was raised in some of the earlier lectures too. It's difficult because it could just be, I think James mentioned, it could just be that wealthy countries decide to go democratic. But an interesting finding that I think this holds pretty well is that you can think about it as, if you have a non-democratic ruler, when you make it could be a tyrant or a despot or a dictator, anything you want to call it, and the ruler gets deposed, then what happens? And it seems quite plausible that when you have even if the person is an awful person that's in charge, if you set up these conditions where you get a relatively broad economic growth, so a middle class, it may be that then when you go to the transition away from the autocrat or the military dictatorship, and you go to democracy, it may just be that the democracy functions better, and then in turn get more growth. Whereas other kinds of tyrants or dictators, if they basically, when they're kicked out or die, you have conditions that are just not very conducive to well-functioning democracy, like factions, or people that basically control wealth that they got through power as opposed to producing valuable things. Then it may be that democracy is just very difficult to establish. And I think that's one of the interesting things. We mentioned, like, transition away from communism in Eastern Europe, but an earlier big wave was colonies obtaining independence, and there I think that the success is very heterogeneous, and I think understanding exactly why some of the former colonies have been more successful than others is a very interesting question. That hasn't, I think some case by case explanations are good, but it's very difficult to come up with a sort of a general theory of how things work. So I look forward to seeing what you find.
Thank you.
We have another question. I'm almost certainly going to mispronounce it, but is it Slawomir, maybe?
Slawomir.
Apologies. Do please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very excellent lecture. The patterns are really interesting and a lot of things to think about it. But my question is, did you think about another problem? How this pattern of changes was affected by the great wars? I think like the great international wars, like Peloponnesian War, Persian Wars in the antiquity, or the World War Wars, first and second in the modern times. Did you think that the pattern changed in the similar way, or any some ideas about this? That's my question. Thank you.
That's an excellent question. I mean, the short answer is we've thought about those things, but nothing in the presentation we did today, reflects any of that. Certainly, we've mapped these transitions, and we, sort of note that was about the time this other thing was happening. But I think that is, the direct effect of wars has been pretty profound in the 20th century, certainly, and in terms of creating countries, creating democracies, destroying countries, and destroying democracies. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. It's not reflected at all in the data that we're showing. I mean, it may be there underlying the data, but it's not something that we thought about specifically in terms of trying to identify this data set. But those are things that we have talked about in other contexts. Yeah, it's in particular, it's like we're hoping to go with this would be to set up more formal statistical tests to try and figure out, are the way that you're seeing these transitions occur, sort of the patterns of transition in an earlier period, can you distinguish based on empirical tests whether it looks like a different pattern than later? And so I think some wars are an obvious place to look for possibilities where the patterns change. The difficulty there is, as we mentioned before, we don't want to, if we just went and checked a bunch of different time periods, we're undoubtedly going to find some times when the statistical test will say, oh yeah, these have seen these changes, but we don't want to be
hunting through the data. We don't want to be data mining and then come up with the finding just by chance. We want to make sure we have a really clear, before we run the test, we want to know what wars we think it is. But I think, you know, something like World War I would be a very interesting thing to test, because I think that had a huge effect on the democracies, as well as, you know, leading to some big changes in other countries, and then, you know, World War II also. So it would be interesting to see if we can come up with a good clean test that would be applied, that would make sense to apply. Say we'll do the same test to the, you know, based on, you said like from like Persian War and then some other war, but that's something we've not yet convinced ourselves we have a clean enough idea to test yet. But
Thank you.
Yeah, actually, we did write one paper where we looked at the tyrannies created under the Persian Empire to try to see if we could spot something different there. And we did, I think, spot a little bit of a difference in that case there, but it was a fairly weak result. So I think it's a very interesting question, the effect of war on, you know, on not just state creation, but also on the kind of governments that are established. And so, you know, starting with that as a question, I think is an interesting idea, but it's not something we proceeded very far on at this point.
Yeah, but actually that sort of takes my back to this. I hadn't thought of this before, but with Edmund's question on getting better measures of tyranny, you know, that would be something that would be pretty interesting, because, you know, we know that the nature of the typical tyrant wasn't the same earlier as later. Yes. And so that would be, if we could find, you know, some changes in the nature of the tyrants, and also which kinds of, you know, what the transitions are to and from. I mean, that would be very interesting. I wouldn't be surprised if that would be something we could relate to a war.
Yes, despite the differences between various types of tyrannies, you know, your results are quite interesting. Yes. Thank you very much.
I wonder, actually, just sort of butting in on there, whether it is an interesting thing that the effect of war on regime change, but it almost seems to be that, well, war, it's not war that really changes things, because both sides, that there will be regimes that will change during the course of a war, but that may be with the ebb and flow. And this seems to be what happened in the Peloponnesian War, that, you know, some cities were constantly trying to, you know, factions within cities were trying to swap sides and change their constitutions. But certainly the end of the Peloponnesian War, I think it seems to be evident in your graph, although you have to look into this in more detail. We do have a drop of democracies. And we also have, I thought as well, another point worth noting was the increase in democracies at the end of the 4th century. And I wonder whether that might be the effect of Alexander the Great, of course, overthrowing a lot of the Persian-sponsored autocracies and oligarchies, and introducing democracies in Ionia. So that was just one thought I had.
No, I mean, that it is interesting. There's, you know, that's you know, at this point we've got no subtlety to these comparisons at all. That's really clear, and it would be interesting to dig in a little deeper and to try to figure some of these things out.
Would anyone else like to? We have just a few minutes left. Lots of things to continue the conversation, but if anyone else would like to, I might just ask you a quick question. Well, just sort of to round off, and coming back on Kenneth Arthur's very interesting question, and I think it would be really nice to also learn more, as you said in the end of your talk, about, well, I wonder whether prediction is quite the right word, because as you say, predicting things is always going to be really impossible. But I wonder whether it's maybe not so much predictions, but, you know, thinking about long-term trends, and whether, you know, and just, I suppose, assuming that long-term trends might, or what we can learn from those. And it seems to me that in some ways there are good causes, as you suggested, for optimism, in the sense that we have seen that established democracies seem fairly well, seem very resilient, but also grounds for pessimism that established tyrannies also seem, well, not resilient. They seem very unstable, but they seem very difficult to democratize. And I wonder whether, I mean, how, it'd be nice to have your opinion on how we can, as academics, sort of bring this research out to the broader world and broader public and policymakers, and how we can sort of show its importance of maybe assessing the risks, because I think it's a question of assessing where are there risks? Are there risks to democracies and established democracies? I think less so, but there are maybe risks more from tyrannies, and tyrannies seem to be more dangerous out of all proportion to their numbers. It seems to me almost we obsess about them because they seem to be more damaging than even though democracies may be in larger numbers. So I was wondering what you thought about that.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a really good, it's a good question to consider. I hadn't really, just to be honest, I mean, I hadn't really thought about that as much. You know, I sort of have my own views and sort of concern about modern tyrannies. But it is, yeah, it is, I guess, you know, sort of thinking about risks to democracies in the modern world. I mean, you know, one obvious thing is just, you know, a neighboring state invading, which is almost never going to be a democracy, invading a democracy. But yeah, sort of the threats from within, but as you pointed out, sort of, I thought it was really interesting, I made a note of it, is that you mentioned sort of tyranny hard, you know, it makes it harder to establish a stable democracy. And I think that's an interesting question that we could probably look at. So I would think if you have a very long history of democracy, and so you haven't had a tyrant for a long time, it's almost certainly just empirically, you're going to see that you're very unlikely to have a tyrant. You know, it'd be very difficult to undo the democracy. But it may just be that, you know, but the question, I guess, I'm thinking about is if you have a history of, say, you've had a couple, you know, episodes of tyranny in the past. This is just bringing us a little bit like Ken was saying about Ghana. So if you have a couple, you know, episodes of military regimes, does that mean that it's going to, is it actually the tyranny that causes it, makes it harder to establish a stable democracy that will last? Because it could be that the tyrants actually made it hard to change because of what they did, or it could just be that there are more underlying conditions. And but anyway, but coming back to your point about, you know, how much should we worry about tyrannies? I think it may have something to do with, you know, the nature of what it is in the pattern. If it's the case that you're a country that's had tyrants and some other country's never had a tyrant, it may be that the country with the history of tyranny really needs to worry. But it's not as obvious that, you know, it's maybe that I mean, my own, just somewhat separate, is my own view is that, you know, countries that seem to avoid, this is not based on our data here at all, but countries that seem to always avoid tyranny generally have very strong institutions, formally written down, and norms that tend to be followed. And so it makes it very hard for the tyrant to take over. You can make huge mistakes, but you generally make the huge mistakes as a democracy. Whereas, you know, other countries that, you know, they seems to be just much more easily, despite the written down rules, for a tyrant to come in. But I guess that comes back to, as far as I don't know how much we should be worried about tyrants in countries that have not had one.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think one thing that's interesting in the modern world are areas like Latin America, where we seem to have almost oscillations between democracy and what we'd call, you know, tyranny, or at least autocracy. And it's, you know, it follows not quite like clockwork, but not far away. And I think no regime ever really gets embedded there. I think that's part of the problem. I think I looked at Bolivia, for example, where I lived for a while. I think they'd had something like 120 constitutions over their 110-year history. So, you know, where you fail to establish something, then it's going to be you're always going to be more subject to change. And so I think that may be the big difference between the modern world and ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, I think Syracuse is a bit of an exception in that they, at least in the records, they really do sort of swing between democracy and tyranny, relatively frequently, whereas most states don't really appear to do that. And I do think we've got a sort of a set of countries in the modern world that are durable democracies. I mean, we're really not too worried about Western Europe suddenly becoming a tyranny. But Latin America, what happened to Venezuela? What we thought was a fairly robust democracy now is in arguably a tyranny. So it is, we really do have this situation where it seems you got this sort of the stable set and you've got this other set. And I think that is, and maybe my knowledge of ancient Greece just isn't enough to know that that was also the case in ancient Greece, but it seems to me that that may be a difference between the modern world and ancient Greece. And that shows up a bit in our data analysis there.
Yeah, one of the things we've talked about a lot is it's very difficult to try and figure out, especially if you're British or American. If you look at the history, and we may get just a view of very stable regimes, and even before Britain was a democracy, very strong protection of rights. And one thing that's quite striking, I think, is you look at the United States, and a very bloody civil war. Less than 100 years after the establishment of democracy, but it wasn't tyranny. It was, it was a very bloody war, but it was basically still maintaining democratic institutions, and not all rule of law, of course, including by Lincoln, but it's but the commitment to democracy seemed to be very strong. Of course, it's a narrow democracy, and and the South had a lot of slaves, and just a brutal, awful regime. Nevertheless, the decisions were voting, and so I think that's there's some reason why some countries tend to do can have even a civil war and not really deep go tyranny. Whereas I think what Andy was saying about some countries in Latin America, I mean they sort of muddle through with regime change, and it really never gets so bad as say the American Civil War, but they don't really have that stable regime.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I mean, this has been a fascinating and really exciting paper to learn more about your research. And as I said, I hope this is the start of more discussions. And indeed, we are still going. We still do have one more lecture in the series, which will be next month, which is perhaps rather fittingly, we're staying in the United States. We have Professor Josiah Ober, who will be speaking to us on a very similar theme of interdisciplinary studies of tyranny and democracy, but of course from the perspective of an ancient historian. So we look forward to seeing you for that. But all that remains to say for this evening is, or indeed this afternoon, is have a very good evening or afternoon, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.